Welcome to Third Party Therapy. My guest today is here to talk about a very topical subject, concentration risk. Gemma Stewart is head of TPRM at Zurich. She has been developing their approach to concentration risk for a number of years. This was a great conversation about what we can be doing now, how this has evolved over time, and also what we need to be doing moving forward in the future as well. I hope you enjoy it. Gemma, hi, how are you?
Morning, Mike. Yeah, good, thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Really appreciate you taking the time. I've known you for a number of years, but obviously our audience don't know you. So you're at Zurich. Could you just explain your role a little bit more, and how long have you been in that role? How did you get into the TPRM space?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I work at Zurich Insurance. I'm the global head of vendor management, which ultimately is third-party risk management, and I'm responsible for the group risk policy, where we set a number of controls at a group level that the countries have to adhere to. And those are things like, doing a criticality assessment of your third parties, having due diligence in place, a contract, ongoing assurance, etc. We also have a third-party governance framework where we help operationalize those controls. The how are you able to do those? And we have a GRC solution as well, again, that we have as a global instance for 40 countries to utilize. And that provides risk assessments such as due diligence, ongoing assurance, but we also use it as our global inventory of third-party arrangements. I've been in that role since 2021, and I've moved around a fair bit in Zurich, but I've done a number of supplier roles. So years ago, I worked in claims outsourcing governance in the UK. I've done strategic sourcing roles, procurement transformation roles, and how I got into the third party role was to pick up a GRC solution back in 2020, purely as a project to simplify and centralize due diligence. And it just snowballed from there, really. So I sort of got into the role almost by mistake. And then, as I say, we've been implementing the policy and the framework and the system across all those countries for the last few years.
You talked there about your global solution, 40 odd countries. What's your geographic spread? Are you mainly European focused? Is it sort of US? What areas are you looking at?
Yeah, so in terms of the policy and the framework, it's Latin America, Asia Pacific, EMEA, and North America. The system that we use is across Latin America, Asia Pacific, and EMEA. North America currently have a different system, but they still need to provide data into our global inventory.
Got it. So we could talk about many, many topics, and we usually do when we catch up. What we want to really focus on today is a point that comes up in many discussions, and I know that you've talked about it in the past, I've talked about it in the past, is around concentration risk, which seems to be an area that a lot of people are trying to get their heads around at the moment. There's a lot of focus on it from a regulatory perspective in the finance industry, and as I'm sure there's plenty of focus in other industries as well. Before we get into the weeds of concentration risk and talk about how you approach it, when we talk about concentration risk, what do you mean? What do you look at when you're thinking about concentration risk?
So we look at what are the risks in the supply chain where concentration could produce a loss that is large enough to threaten our ability to maintain our core operations, or financially. So it's something that's going to impact our business resilience, essentially.
Okay. And what sort of, I know that there's obviously different types of concentration risk. I think the obvious one that a lot of people focus on is quite often geographic concentration risk, or that's almost the historic one. But what types of concentration risk do you look at, or do you try and bring it all together?
Yeah, I mean, geographic is normally the first one people tackle. In a sense, it's possibly one of the easiest ones to tackle, but it's also, very key. I think there's been an acceleration in the geographical concentration risk space, particularly because of events, geopolitical events, conflicts and wars. That's really driven people to start to realise that if they have a large supply base in that location, they could come under under severe strain from that. So that still tends to be the one that people start with, but there are others. So there's 5 sort of commonly known. There's service dependency, so the extent of a third party supporting your critical business processes. For example, if you have one third party that covers your IT infrastructure, you could potentially be at risk if that third party becomes insolvent, stops trading, but also they have a lot of leverage over you as well. So there's a dependency there. Reverse concentration, where the proportion of the third party's revenue or their highest proportion is with you. So if you were to take your contract away, potentially you cause them significant risk of failure. Then you have fourth party. Fourth party is, again, really becoming prevalent because of the regulators starting to have expectations around that. It's always been something we've sort of kept on the edge because we haven't wanted to go past our third parties necessarily. But that's certainly becoming more prevalent, especially with DORA and regulations like that coming. And then you have spend. So the level of spend that we have with a third party as well. So you have the single usage, the service dependency, the spend, geographic fourth party, and that reverse concentration. So there's quite a lot there, but I think you're right. People are tending to focus on geographic and fourth party at the moment.
And I think that point about reverse concentration risk is quite key, because it from my experience, it's the one that people don't tend to think about, when they're looking at it. It's quite difficult to get to, if you're using financial statements that could be 12, 18 months old. But it's definitely something I've seen, especially for larger banks, larger insurance companies that can have that level of power, that level of spend over a supplier. I think it's definitely something that can't be ignored.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about concentration risk, what are you guys doing? What have you implemented, and what are you doing, and how are you looking at it within Zurich? Because I know it's an area that you've had a lot of focus on at the moment.
Yeah, it has. I mean, again, there had been a sort of a couple of events in the past where we wanted to understand our concentration risk, but it took many weeks, possibly months, to try to find the data to even understand that. Checking service locations and data locations and things of that nature. So we started essentially with a focus in our global inventory to start to gather the data that we could utilize for concentration risk. So we've spent a lot of time pulling together information about the third party, the services they provide, the service location that they are in, because quite often they provide services from a different location to the contract location. They may provide services from multiple locations. So we understand that, and the data location as well, where our data is being stored, because obviously data for us as an organization is a really key asset to protect. So we gathered that data as a starting point. We've been, as a sort of a slightly later iteration of that, we've started to gather the fourth party data as well, similarly focusing around the locations and the service type. And then we wanted to use that data essentially to look at, where are our risks. So and it has shown quite an improvement. When the Ukraine conflict then started, we were able to use that data to identify the third parties that we providing services from there, literally within a few minutes. And then we were able to look at those service types. That service type data is really critical because, if you're a company where facility services is not as important to you, it's not critical for you, then you wouldn't necessarily be worrying about a supplier in that location necessarily. So it is about coupling the data up to look at the location, but also whether those services are critical enough for you to warrant taking action. It comes back to that question of is this really a risk to us? So we started with that data, and then we started to be able to analyze that. We were at a point where we could then use that data very quickly to reach out to those third parties, particularly the critical ones, and check what business resilience plans we had in place. Were we comfortable they could move those services to another location quite quickly if needed?
Mhm.
Were there alternative methods, or did we have concerns that there wasn't a continuity plan in place, and then what action would we take from there? So it is quite key to have that data there, but the data will only tell you so much, and then it is a case of engaging with the third party to figure out what the actual risk to you is and what action plan you want to put in place.
So the word data comes up a lot, and it sounds a simple statement to say we just get the data, but I think, to my mind, and I think from conversations with other people, that how we get the data in the first place and how we keep on top of the data is a huge challenge. How do you go about getting that third party, fourth party data and staying on top of it?
So at the moment for new contracts, that's fairly straightforward. We gather the information at that time and store it in our global inventory. We do that through the contract discussions, but also the due diligence. We will also ask about the fourth parties during the due diligence, including their service types and locations. The challenge for us then was the historical contracts that we had in place. It could be quite difficult to find the documentation that was necessary. So we have an AI solution in place that will read the contract for us and pull out relevant data fields that we need. So that removed a lot of the manual effort, because it took at least 12 months for us to be going back and looking at contracts, even those ones that were critical, to try to identify service, data locations, fourth parties, and a number of those we still had to go to the third party and ask them. So it was a lot of data gathering manually for the historical contracts. New contracts were slightly easier. And for the ongoing piece, for critical services, 12 months later, we will do an ongoing assurance check. And within that, we will be asking them if they have changed any service or data locations without letting us know. And we have had a couple of examples where that has happened. And we also ask about any changes to the fourth parties as well. So we're trying to be a little bit more proactive in asking the third parties rather than expecting them to update us.
Absolutely. And so whilst you can obviously get a relatively broad coverage in terms of your third party, because you have those relationships directly with them, you have the contracts. When it goes into the fourth party space, there's a lot more effort involved, I would guess, in each supplier to get that data. How much of your supply chain do you look at fourth parties? Do you really just focus on your sort of criticals, materials? Do you try and cover more of that? Is it sort of data led? How do you which ones do you focus on?
Yeah, I mean, we do focus on the critical. So we have a tiering structure where we currently have low, medium, and high risk tiers for our third parties based on a criticality assessment. So for the high and the medium, we do ask about fourth parties during due diligence. But when we ask them about their or our fourth parties, we're also asking them to focus on the critical ones. So we're not looking for data, for their third parties that are postal services, for example.
Yeah.
But if our third party is providing claims handling arrangement, for example, and they have subcontracted part of that service out, or their IT infrastructure is very critical to being able to continuously deliver that service, we would be looking for information about those fourth parties. So we try to, focus on the ones that we're actually going to do something about. We certainly don't ask it for our lower risk arrangements. We don't ask about
It's,
it at all
it's
because we won't actually take any action on it.
so it's very much your effectively your critical subcontractors to your critical suppliers is where you're focusing your energy and your resources, which, if it all boils back to a proportionate approach, I think is quite consistent with what we've seen elsewhere. Um, what do you do with that data? So you've got all of this data. and we talk about concentration risk, and some people are throwing in things like, do you have a threshold for it? What do you do? How do you take that data and actually turn it into something meaningful that can be used and consumed within your organization?
Yeah, so we map the data to start with. I mean, again, there's lots of ways of doing it. Excel, smart charts, and things like that. We use Power BI, so we are pushing the data into Power BI and creating pretty maps with filters to allow people to filter by service type as well. So it will provide the country and the city of the service locations and the data locations in different maps, and then you're able to filter that by your country. So we can have that data at a global aggregation level. If I'm honest, that tends to dilute the picture too much, and then we have it at a regional level and then at a country level, so we can see at different sort of lenses. But we also add the service type data, because if for us, critical outsourcing of anything that impacts the customer is going to be a higher risk. So if we have 10 critical claims arrangements in one location, and that location is high risk, whether that's because of geopolitical events or natural disasters, or we know that they're in a flood prone area, whatever it may be, then we want to sort of take action with it. So the service type level is important. We map that in Power BI. We don't actually have a threshold at the moment, and that's because to different countries, the risk will be slightly different. So, we could set it at 5 critical services in one location. But again, you really still need to work with the third party and understand the business continuity plans, because whilst the data and a map can show you've got an initial risk, you still need to drill into that risk with the third party
Yeah.
to understand whether they already have things in place that mitigate that risk enough that you are comfortable to allow things to stay as they are. So we don't currently set a threshold, but you could, if you felt you had a strong enough risk appetite for it. That could be something we develop over time as we get more used to running these assessments, and we're starting to see a trend. But for now, we keep that open.
And I think that you're right, because the approach that we take, a threshold on something like this is so subjective. It really is. And to your point about working with the supplier and their exit plans, I think the key to what you're doing, and which is very similar to what we're doing, and I think what a number of other people are looking at, is to get this to a risk, you need to have the good old favourites of impact and likelihood. And we can do all the mapping of where are our important business services being delivered from, where are our suppliers, how many of our services relate to one fourth party. All of that is the impact. And you can say, well, if that goes down, this is what the impact is. You're not looking at the likelihood. You're not looking at, for example, the financial strength of those companies. As you said, the substitutability, the BCP plans they've got. Maybe if it's geographic data, the geopolitical changes in a particular country. That's what's going to drive the likelihood, isn't it? So, and it's almost an evolution. We can't get to that point until we've got all the data, until we can do exactly what you're talking about there in mapping it all out and and bringing it to life. And then we can start, turning it into a risk, so to speak.
Exactly that. And I think in our industries, we tend to sort of favour 9-box grids of, with axes of likelihoods and triggers and things of that nature. Not all industries would potentially go to that level, but something as basic as scenario testing, where you sit in a room and say, okay, what will actually happen if this scenario takes place? So if there is a natural catastrophe or a conflict, what actually happens to our services? Do we have those solutions in place? Does a third party have them into place? Do we have an exit plan? Do we have contingencies? And again, if you can walk those scenarios through and you're fairly comfortable with the outcome, it doesn't mean you have to take any action at all. But if you find additional sort of risks along the way. Sometimes that also then triggers the fact that you don't have exit or termination plans or contingency in place that would actually work. So again, scenario testing is quite a good way of sitting and looking at that in a room without too much effort.
Absolutely. And I think when you get to the fourth party piece, I think that becomes a very interesting angle and actually quite complicated to do in a desktop exercise, in terms of, if a large cloud provider was to fail, you can argue whether that's a plausible situation or not, but you would see operational impacts across your supply chain, and trying to piece them together would be quite key. I've actually started to see AI being applied to these to try and bring, because of the complexity of the interdependencies, that your basic desktop walkthrough where we say we'll do this, we'll do that, is becoming more and more limited, and therefore you need that background analysis to try and work out where you would see the impact, especially if we're talking about cloud impact and things like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And I think, like, to touch on a point you sort of made there as well, is we spend quite a lot of time gathering this data and maintaining this data, but there are a lot of tools now that are improving day by day with nth party mapping. So there are tools that can automatically give you this information. The slight kind of con of that is that there's a lot of information, and it's trying to find that point of where do you cut that off, because there's so much that you can almost drown in that data. But it is something, again, we're going to start looking at for next year, to whether we can use that data to enhance what we have, particularly because of obviously DORA regulations now, with a focus on fourth parties. And we have the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, I think it is in 2027. But again, looking at your actual supply chain mapping much further than your fourth party. So I think that is potentially using that data intelligence as the next driver, but I think we want to use it more as an enhancement layer rather than the only point of information.
and you bring up a very good point there, because concentration risk, at least in the finance industry, is being primarily driven from an operational resilience angle. If something happens, what's the impact on our service? And in parallel to that, a personal data GDPR piece as well. But there are other regulations like CSRD and CS3D coming through from an environmental perspective. If you look at the Modern Slavery Act amendment, which is currently stuck in Parliament, they start to put a different lens on the supply chain, and arguably mean that we're going to have to be looking at different suppliers from a fourth party lens than we do today. Hopefully we're not having to map out the entire thing, because at some point it gets completely unmanageable. But I think we're going to see this requirement expand and expand as we go broader. Absolutely. How do you see? We touched on sort of the visualization that you do, and I think that's quite an important part. I think one of the core benefits of our TPRM programs is, we can do the preventative, we can do the control assessments, but ultimately having the data that when something happens, we know our relationships, we know which, who to go to, we know where they are, we know what data they've got, they know if they're touching the customer. In many ways, that's a far, far better position for us to be in than we probably all were, a number of years ago. How do you bubble that up to sort of the exec board level? What's the sort of consumable output of that you can talk to senior management about as a result of this analysis?
Yeah, to be honest, we don't tend to have concentration risk as a regular topic for those meetings. But what we do is when we have an event or a risk, we will proactively contact them to say, we've done the concentration risk report. So the Ukraine conflict, as an example, we were easily able to go to them, that day to say, we've identified the third parties, the service types, the risk, and now we're working with the third parties. We'll update you in X number of time. And then we went back later on to say, look, we only found one arrangement where we've got significant risk, so we are looking to transfer that to an alternative third party. So we kind of give them more of a proactive response to let them know what we're doing, but we don't regularly send them a report on sort of concentration risk levels of things like that.
You sort of dip into it when there's something to talk about, and to give them the assurance that you've still got your arms around it, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is an area that's emerging at the moment. Have you seen any other approaches to concentration risk being taken elsewhere, or are you aware of alternative approaches that people have had? Because I've had conversations with people about where they are looking at putting thresholds in place, and they are looking at sort of trying to drive behaviour. It is, and everybody seems to have a slightly different nuance on it. What's your view on the general approach to concentration risk? Do you think it's something that's still emerging, or do you think there's a commonality of approach at the moment?
I mean, certainly the companies I talk to are still at the sort of stage of pulling data together, because it is very time consuming. I mean, like I say, that took us a good 12 months, because you've got other activities to be getting on with. So I do think that's quite a slow burn. But I think it's, certainly they're starting to use the data. They're not waiting until they've got a full database. People are starting to use the data. I think the threshold side of things is quite key, to be able to start somewhere. To try to look at all of the different concentration risk types and all of the data, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I think it's inserting a threshold or some criteria that says, right, we're going to focus on one particular type. We're going to focus on our critical arrangements. We're going to put a threshold in of whatever that may be to suit their risk appetite. At least it gives them that starting point. And then through the use of that, those thresholds could change over time as they get more mature. But yeah, I certainly think that it's a really good approach to try to focus on a smaller portion to get started.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting because the approach that I've been looking at is, I went down the road of trying to map it out through sort of mind map type diagrams and things like that. And it's interesting to look at. But then I've sort of reverted back to almost like a league table approach. So it's, the more critical services or higher risk services that a company provides, the more times that it features as a subcontractor to a critical supplier, the more important business services it supports directly, the higher up the list it goes, based on a sort of a back end scoring. So it's not saying that these are high risk and these are low risk. It's just trying to draw the attention to the ones at the top, because they're going to require more focus and more consideration. And as we said before, you can then start to look at their financial position. You can start looking at things like that. But it is still very much early days. So we've done all of this work. We've got this analysis. We've got this data. We can show management, we can show the business units where their concentration risk is. When it comes to doing something about it, actually mitigating concentration risk, that will presumably depend on what type. If it's geographic, one would assume you could look at shifting services around. But when it comes to that sort of service, that third party, fourth party concentration risk, can you actually mitigate it? Is that something you can mitigate, or is that just a factor of business decisions that you just have to monitor?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's easier with the third party. So I think it is, as you say, it's very important thinking about that from a league table perspective. The location and on its own is not enough. So you do need to add some information, and then you need to start working to look at what can be done. What are your alternatives? With the fourth parties, we're able to identify those fourth parties now that sit across multiple third parties. But the reality is, you can't really expect all of those third parties to just change that fourth party. And what fourth party are they going to change it to? How do you know that that fourth party is going to be any better than the third, the one that you're working with today? I think that is going to be our biggest challenge. I think through kind of DORA and also the PRA looking at the banking industry in particular, with this regulator focus on fourth parties and them potentially having the power to sort of step in, I think that's where things will start to change. It will almost be like we want to see what their intention is,
Yeah.
and could we leverage a similar approach. But at the moment, we sort of have that data that says these are your important fourth parties, and some of them are large companies, AWS and things of that nature. The reality is people are not going to move away from them. So you need to be more looking at your risk appetite and what you're prepared to accept. I think then, even if you decide you're going to move away from your third party, you almost need to assess their fourth parties before you start working with them. So it's sort of bringing us back to, we've always avoided due diligence and assessments of fourth parties. We've sort of left it to our third parties and said, well, you're responsible for doing due diligence and making sure they're robust. But I do think in time it's going to kind of come full circle, and that's going to be part of the assessment before you start working with a third party as well.
And I think as the marketplace evolves as well, I mean, one of the reasons why we haven't done assessment on fourth parties is we don't have a relationship with them. So you can't go to them. But as products like, the financial due diligence solutions, your cyber scoring capability comes along, as those products get more comprehensive, you can do a more non-intrusive due diligence on fourth parties where you don't have a relationship. And actually, you might have a third-party relationship somewhere else, which gives you that capability and that visibility to do it.
I mean, there's a company I'm going to have a call with soon, because just through another sort of contact, I understand they are using a solution to carry out due diligence and assessments of their third parties, but they've opened that solution up to their third parties to allow them to do their supply chain due diligence. So they've actually got access to the outcomes of their fourth parties, in effect, by sharing one instance with their supply chain. So it's quite an interesting concept. It's not one I've sort of heard anybody being brave enough to do yet. But again, I think that's also another potential to for us to all start sharing data, across companies, would also be a huge benefit, I think, because we're all looking at very similar data in a very similar way, but in our own silo.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge of that. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, that's almost like the nirvana state where we all can access the same data. And there are a number of solutions out there that start to get to that point. But there's also a lot of different standards in terms of the data that we're collecting. And as much as we like to think we're quite unique, within the finance sector, we're probably all asking the same sort of questions. Within the defense sector, they're asking the same sort of questions.
Mm.
So there's definitely more scope there. I think it's just a case of, in many ways, because there's different solutions, that just, people have to make a decision as to which ones they buy into, and which way they go on that one. Just going back to your previous point in the cloud pieces, I think that's a particularly interesting area. So concentration risk tends to point back to your big cloud providers, your AWS, your Microsoft, maybe your Googles, and the PRA, FCA, and Treasury have just produced the critical third parties document, published yesterday, finally. So I think we're sort of still just getting our head around the final changes on that one. But your point's absolutely true. Is if you've got a fourth party dependency on one of those, if you're buying SaaS solutions, which majority of us are, because that's just in the marketplace, those SaaS solutions are going to be sitting on one of those, probably on one of those three, maybe there was a couple of other hosted solutions out there. It's almost unavoidable, isn't it?
Right.
In terms of, if you want to play in that market and you need a SaaS tool, you are going to be dependent on probably 2 out of 3 of those providers. And if you do try and swap, you're just going to swap one concentration risk to another concentration risk. So I think one of the things that, when we talked about it earlier, is those plausible scenarios, is when we're looking at those big cloud providers, is whether we can look at a more geographical approach. So, if it's AWS, if it's Azure, rather than saying all of our services are on AWS, we've got a concentration risk, we can start looking down at the next level. Which availability zones are they in? Which data centers are they in? Can we diversify our portfolio so we haven't got that sort of concentration risk? Because that's a more plausible situation, that one of those zones or one of those data centers goes down, rather than everything going down at once. And that ties into geographic risk. And I think that's where it's starting to go, is whilst we talk about service risk and fourth party, third party, and we talk about geographic risk, bringing those all together and sort of trying to look at where that is. Because I think that's really the only areas we can really mitigate effectively, is by looking at areas we can move around as well.
Yeah, certainly. And we know a lot of that data as well through doing data transfer impact assessments with third parties. So, yeah, I think you're right. It really is about starting to take what we've learned on the third party level and move it to the fourth.
Absolutely.
It's going to take a while.
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we try and do on the podcast is just take a few lessons learned away. So, it's always interesting to hear things that people have tried and it's not quite worked out as expected. Have you got any cases where either, you've seen something tried around this space that's not really panned out as expected, overly complicated, or anything that you've heard that's useful?
Yeah, I think so. The reason I sort of bang on quite a lot about service types and adding different data lenses is because we did have an example in a country where they actually spent about 4 months. They got very overexcited with the initial data around locations, and then spent a lot of time and effort looking at locations, the third parties that were sat there, but without looking at the services they provided, or what information we already had around business continuity. And they started to pull those contracts apart to the extent of moving services, changing third parties, terminating contracts early without even having a conversation with the third party. So not only did they spend significant amount of time and effort that was quite frankly unnecessary in the most part, they also upset some long-standing third-party relationships in looking to terminate without even having a conversation or understanding, what was happening there. So for me, like, they're still sort of unpicking that now and trying to smooth things over. But it was the time, the effort, the impact was actually very negative because you've just looked at one data point and started to panic. So it is really looking at that data, adding the other information, really taking a step back, scenario testing and understanding, I think to your point earlier, is it actually a risk to you that you want to do something about? That's really the bottom line.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we often ask, and I've heard it asked all over, that phrase, so what? You get all of this data, it shows you this picture, you might have reds, ambers, greens, high risks, low risks. What does it actually mean? What's it actually telling you that we actually have to do? And trying to distill that and not act until you understand that is probably key. So, Gemma, just to finish off with, what try and do is leave people with a few practical ideas. So if they're looking at concentration risk going, I've no idea what we should do here, where would, if you were starting this all again, if you had blank sheet of paper, how would you start that journey around looking at concentration risk?
I wouldn't change the fact that its foundation is on the data, to having the right data. So to stop and think about the processes that you have today when you are sourcing, contracting, running due diligence, when you're initially working with that third party, to gather as much of that information as you can and to have a central inventory. It could be a GRC, it could be a SharePoint. It doesn't have to necessarily be a specific thing, but the data is really key in starting to gather it over a period of time, and then start to apply those risk lenses to it. Again, just starting with one particular type of concentration that you think is most prevalent to your organization, just starting somewhere, and it's a maturity journey over time. But one thing I wouldn't change is the data gathering and the inventory setup. Though that is what ultimately has made us be able to tackle it fast and efficient. When something does go wrong that we didn't even see coming, that is really the key to it. Without that data and centrally stored and maintained, you're really just not going to know what's there in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've definitely seen that as well in this area and other areas as well. If you start trying to do complex analysis and dashboards and drive decisions and you haven't fixed the underlying data, you haven't got the underlying data right, you'll always struggle. So get the data, fix that. You can use that data in a situation, and that's got to be your starting position.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Gemma, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you very much. And I'll speak to you soon.
Lovely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Third Party Therapy. If you like that, why not click on the like button below and subscribe so you get updates in the future, and head over to thirdpartytherapy.com and sign up to our mailing list. Thank you very much.